A very good morning to you all and a warm welcome to Deepwater Baptist Church online. Well, this week has been the momentous week that many have been waiting for, as the Prime Minister unveiled the roadmap to recovery, the plan for how the country will get out of lockdown. After a long time of wondering if we would ever come out of lockdown, we now know the way ahead. But perhaps after all this time of waiting and a few false starts, we struggle to believe that this time we really are coming out of lockdown, that this really is the roadmap to recovery. In our passages today, we see God reveal his roadmap to recovery for mankind, but it was a roadmap that was a little hard to believe. Stage 1 of God's roadmap to recovery involved an elderly couple named Abraham and Sarah. But before we get into that, you might be wondering, why was it necessary for God to have a roadmap to recovery? Well, just like we've been in lockdown because of a global pandemic, the Bible talks about a much more infectious disease called sin. And at the start of the Bible, we read about God's amazing creation and his amazing plan for humanity. But God also gave us free will, the choice to do things God's way or to do things our own way. And just like today, when human beings decide to do things their own way, we tend to get into a mess. If you read through the first few chapters of Genesis, you'll see that the human race had a few false starts. And despite God's best efforts, people still chose to do things their own way. So in Genesis chapter 12, the story focuses in on one chosen family through whom God would redeem the whole world. This was God's roadmap to recovery for his people, a way to bring about the purpose that he had for humanity right from the very beginning. This was the roadmap that would set people free from the global pandemic of sin. So God told Abraham that he would be the father of many nations. In fact, God told Abraham that his offspring would be as numerous as the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore. That's a lot of children. He also told him that trying to count his children would be as impossible as counting the dust of the earth. So God clearly wanted to bless Abraham and Sarah with a large family. The trouble was, Abraham and Sarah were in their 70s at this time, and they had no children. So if this was going to happen, it would take a real miracle. Well, they waited patiently for years, but in the end, they got tired of waiting for God's promise to be fulfilled. And so they decided to take matters into their own hands. Always a sign of trouble, that one. And so they have a son, Ishmael, through Sarah's maidservant, Hagar. Now God says he will bless Ishmael, but this is not God's roadmap to recovery. And God tells Abraham that his promise will still be fulfilled. God tells Abraham and Sarah that they will still have a child of their own, and through them, all nations on earth will be blessed. But by this time, Abraham is 99 years old, and Sarah is 89. So Abraham finds it hard to believe that this is still possible. And Abraham falls face down and laughs, and he says to himself, will a son be born to a man 100 years old? And will Sarah really bear a child at the age of 90? But as a sign of his promise, God gives Abraham and Sarah new names. Prior to this, Abraham was named Abram, and Sarah was named Sarai. Abram means exalted father or holy father, probably in reference to God. So in other words, God is exalted father. That's what Abram meant. But Abraham means father of many. So God gave Abraham a name that will always remind him of God's promise to make him a father of many. Sarai means princess, but Sarah hadn't felt like she was a princess. She hadn't felt very valuable. God hadn't blessed her with a family of her own. So was she really that precious to God? But Sarah means my princess. God gave her the name my princess. A lovely little detail, isn't it? Sarah didn't feel very valuable at all, but God said to her, "You are my princess." I wonder, do you ever feel like Abraham that you're too old to be used by God? Or perhaps you might feel like Sarah, that you don't feel very valued by others or maybe even by God. So maybe the first thing to take from this passage is that you are very precious to God and that it's never too late with God. You're never too old for God to use you. And sure enough, Abraham and Sarah had a son. And as God instructed them, they call him Isaac. Now, that name is significant too, because remember how Abraham laughed at the thought of being a dad at the age of 100? Well, the name Isaac means he laughs, or laughter. And it's a significant name for Sarah too. Sarah thought she could not have children. Other women laughed at her, but she would be the one laughing now. God had given her the joy of having a family of her own. And what a family it was. Isaac became the father of Jacob, and Jacob was named Israel and became the father of the 12 tribes of Israel, God's chosen people. But that's not the end of the story. God had much bigger plans to end the power of sin once and for all. One of Jacob's sons was Judah, and if we trace Judah's family tree far enough, we get to Jesus, God's ultimate recovery plan. But this wasn't going to be the way people expected either. Jesus was an amazing man. People were astonished at his teaching and amazed by the miracles that he performed. People had all sorts of opinions about who Jesus was. And one day, Jesus asked his disciples, "Who do you say I am?" Well, at that moment, the light bulb went off for Peter, and Peter said, "You are the Messiah. You're the Son of the living God." Peter recognized that Jesus was God's anointed king, the rescue plan that the prophets had talked about for centuries, the roadmap to recovery. Peter was looking forward to the day when Jesus would lead them to overthrow the Romans and declare himself king in Jerusalem. And Peter would be proud to be a disciple of the king and bask in the reflective glory of being a disciple of Jesus. But Jesus said, it's not going to be quite like that. He explained that he would suffer and die. Well, that wasn't what Peter had in mind. So Peter takes Jesus aside. We don't have the details of that conversation, but I imagine that Peter said something like, "Oh, come on, Jesus, you're not going to die. You're God's chosen king. If anyone's going to die, it will be the people that try to stand in your way." But Jesus said, that might be the way that people see it, but that was not God's roadmap. Jesus knew that the way ahead was the way of the cross. And Jesus said if anyone wants to follow him, they must follow him on the road of sacrifice. Being a disciple of Jesus is not about reflective glory. It's about putting others' needs above your own, just as he did. It's about humility and serving God and others. It's about self-sacrifice, not about self-indulgence. But let's not confuse that with meaning that we save ourselves, or that we are saved by our good works. We don't serve others in order to be accepted by God, or in order to receive his grace. We serve others in response to the love and grace that God has given us. So it's not a condition of salvation, but it's something that flows naturally from a relationship with Jesus. We start to become like him. Paul explains to the church in Rome, it was not through the law that Abraham and his offspring received the promise that he would be heir to the world, but through the righteousness that comes by faith. And Paul explains that that promise is for us too. No matter what your race or background, or how many false starts we've had, or how old we are. Jesus is the once for all vaccine that can put an end to the power of sin in your life. He's the roadmap to recovery, so as you can be the person that God created you to be. So remember, you're never too old to be used by God, and whatever others may think of you, or even what you think of yourself, you are very precious to God. And however many false starts you've had, however much sin has taken a hold in your life, it's never too late to get your vaccine. So put your faith in Jesus, because he and he alone is God's roadmap to recovery. May God bless you all. Amen.